Right, so a few videos back, we've set up Storybook with our project, but we never actually got to deploy it. And in this episode, let's fix that. Now, if you look at the build folder of Storybook, so this is the folder that you're gonna get if you run storybook:build. It's basically a handful of static files. So index.html, the iframe where we serve our components, a bunch of JavaScript, a favicon, and a manifest file. And that's basically it. It's just a bunch of static files. And if these are static files, it means that we can deploy them to a static host. For example, GitHub Pages. So it's a free host connected to GitHub, and there's in fact a handful package called Pages on NPM, and we can use it to deploy to GitHub Pages very easily. So once we install it, we can actually use it from the CLI. So we can call pages-d and passing in the name of the directory that we want to deploy. So in this example, everything in the dist directory is going to be deployed to the static host. In our use case, we're going to need to deploy everything in Storybook static directory. So let me switch back to the terminal. I'm going to do an install of Pages, and once it finishes, let's go back to our package JSON. So in here, I'm going to add a new script. I'm going to call it deploy, and we're going to invoke Pages, passing in the -d option, and we're going to point to storybook-static. Now, before that command is run, we also want to make sure that the folder actually exists, because for example, I could delete it myself, and if I run this command right now, it's going to fail because this folder doesn't exist yet. So we can add a script similar to how we added pre-build when we wanted to clean up the dist directory. We could also add pre-deploy. And so before we deploy, we want to make sure to run npm run storybook:build. So this pre-script is going to first invoke storybook build. It's going to build the storybook static folder with all the assets. And then after that, the deploy command will take over. So let's switch back to the terminal and let's try npm run deploy. So it's going to build up the static assets and it's going to be deploying them in a second. All right, so if everything is successful, you're going to see published at the end. And now we can switch back to our repo. If I refresh, you're going to see a new tab pop up. It's called environment. So if you click on it, we're going to see that there's been a deployment. So if we click on view deployment, you could see that this URL is now alex996.github.io/react_css spinners. And now the cool thing about GitHub Pages is you can deploy multiple repositories that you have on GitHub to that service. So in this case, we deployed React CSS spinners, but if you want to create another project, you can also deploy it on a separate URL. Right, so it looks like it worked fine. So we have all the three spinners. So I'm just going to do git status. So let me do add package lock, and then I'll do git add -p. So we'll add a few scripts and then GitHub Pages. So let's do a commit now -m add deploy script to GitHub Pages, and let's push it. In fact, I'm actually going to go back to the browser. Let me copy the URL, and if I switch back, I'm gonna go to homepage and I'll change it from the GitHub repo to the URL of the project. So even though we pushed, I'll go back. Let me add it again. So I'll do a git commit -amend -no edit, and I'll do a git push -f. Right, so as a disclaimer, this isn't something you would do on the master branch. Like you wouldn't do a git push -f because it can potentially overwrite files, but it's a very small change, so I don't think it's going to do much harm. Right, so from there we can create our first release. So let me go back to the terminal. Let me just make sure there's no changes. So I'm going to do git tag version 1.0.0. Now this one, of course, will match the version in package JSON, and it's going to be this one, specified as version, obviously. So this way we can go back and let's tag it. So now if you do git tag, you're going to see one. That's going to be our first release. So let's do git push --tags. So that's going to create a new tag. If you refresh this page, you're going to see a new release. So what we can do from there is we can add a few release notes. So I'll pick the existing tag. This one, version 1.0.0. We can also add a description, first release, ta-da, and we can preview it. All right, so let's publish it. And so this is our first release. And now from there, we can actually publish it on NPM. Now, the first thing you would need to do is you would need to sign up at npmjs.org. And once you do, you're going to be able to see all of your packages. I don't have any at the moment, but if I switch back to the terminal, once again, on your computer, the first thing you would need to do is you would need to issue a command known as npm add user. It also has an alias of npm login, but either way, it's going to ask you a few basic questions like your username, email, and name. And once you complete this step, it's going to create an npm rc file in your home directory. And this one is going to contain a secret auth token that you're going to use to publish to npm. But once that's done, you're going to be able to do npm publish So once again, you can verify the package.json file. In fact, it's good that I came back because we need a new section here. So there's a few things we can do. So we can either create a file called npm ignore, and this is where we're going to list all the files or directories that we want to ignore. So for example, we might want to ignore, let's say, mocks, dist. We might also want to ignore examples. And in fact, there's quite a few files that we want to blacklist from being published to npm. Now, if you don't create this file, what's going to happen is that npm is going to default to git ignore. And if git ignore doesn't suffice, so if there's so many different files that we want to ignore, it might be easier to whitelist the files and folders that you do want to be published to npm. So in this case, we want to publish the dist folder. Besides the dist folder, npm is also going to include the package.json file itself, the license file, and also the readme. And actually, there's a few other files that it might include. So as you can see, certain files will be included regardless of these settings. So let's say the package.json file, as I said, the readme, the license file, as well as the changelog, and also the notice file if any of those exist. So once again, in this case, we're going to be publishing the dist folder. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a pre-publish script. In this case, before we publish, we want to run npm run build. So we want to regenerate the build just in case the files have changed since the last commit. And I think with that, it should be good to go. So now if we go back to the terminal, it should be safe to do npm publish. So let's try it. So it'll create the build for us and then publish it to npm. So now if we do npm info react css spinners, it's going to tell us that it's been published just now by Alex996. So if I go back to npm, if I refresh, here's the package. And now we also get a few links like the homepage. There's also a link to the GitHub repo. And now we can actually see the versions. So there's one which is 1.0.0. Now let's actually go back to the terminal and let's try it out. And I'll switch to sandbox. So let's do npx create react app, and I'll call it react css spinners demo. So let's go in there. I'm going to add a dependency of react css spinners. So once again, like I did before, I'm going to go to app css. I'm going to switch the colors for contrast. Let's go to app.js. Let's import our spinners. So let's do from react CSS spinners. So we're going to be importing ellipsis. Let's do ring and let's do ripple. So we're going to output all of them. So let me just copy the names. All right, I'm just going to wrap them in tags like that. So if I go back, I'll do yarn start. And let's see if this works. So as you can see, we get all the three spinners. So the release was successful in the end. Now, if you do an ls on the node modules, React CSS spinners, you're going to see that we only get the dist folder as well as the license file, package.json, of course, and also the readme. So because of the files field that we specified, we only get those three files and the dist directory, which by the way contains all of the builds. The common.js one, the ESM one, and also the UMD one. Now the other cool thing is that if we now go to unpackage, we should be able to now do React CSS spinners. And as you can see, this one defaults to version 1/dist/bundle common.js.js. And it defaults to this file because this is the file that is specified as the entry point for the main field in package.json. So in fact, what you could do for a website is you can put in .umd.js, and this will give you the UMD bundle. So you could take this URL and use it as a CDN. And this way you could use it on any website without any build setup. In fact, we already have an example for it in the CDN folder. Instead of pointing to node modules, we can now point to the unpackage URL instead. And so the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to update the README file. And in fact, we can actually preview it. So I'll go back to GitHub. If I were to edit the README, we could paste it in and preview the changes. So it looks pretty good to me. So now I'm also going to add a section for installation, one for usage, and perhaps one for copyright. And by the way, feel free to skip this section because there's not much interesting in it. So let me add a quick shell script section. Now for unpackage, I'll add some HTML. So this will be a script tag. And now for the source, we're going to reference unpackage, and we can reference this URL. In fact, I think we can also reference the latest tag. Let's see if this works. And this one is going to redirect to the latest one. In this case, 1.0.0, because that's the only one. Instead of hard coding the version, I'll just put latest. And this is what's known as a dist tag. So every project will have the latest dist tag. And this one is just an alias to the latest version. And now for usage, I'll add some JavaScript. So you could import ellipsis from React CSS spinners. In fact, I'll add a link to the demo. So I'll use the homepage. So I know there's actually tools that allow you to write Markdown much quicker, but I prefer the raw approach. All right, so let's see if we can add an attribution. So we're going to do something like this, I'm thinking. So let's say CSS spinners from loading.io. Hopefully that'll suffice. Again, I don't think this is mandatory, but let's give credit where credit is due. So now it looks like this file is being updated by Prettier, and it's also adding the semicolon and using the double quotes. That's not a big deal, of course, but I'm actually going to just ignore markdown files. So this way I can go back and change it to the way I want it to be. Oh, and also let's add a few examples. So there's one for CDN. Let's add one for create React app and one for server side rendering. So we can actually reference the existing directories. All right, so let's copy and preview it. So I'll go and try to edit. So that looks good to me. So I'm gonna commit it and that should be it. So let's do git status, git add, update readme, and now push, and we should be good to go. All right, so that's basically it for now. So I'm gonna stop here for the time being. Of course, there's a lot more that can be done with this library. Right now, we only have dummy components that don't really accept any props, and it would be useful to customize the color of our spinners. Also customize things like the font size, for example, because right now it's all fixed and hard-coded. So we can definitely do something like that. Perhaps add a few props to the component, also add the prop types. We would also have to then remove it for certain builds, and perhaps we would also add a changelog down the road. But for the time being, like I said, that's pretty much it for this project. So once again, we have a nice demo of the spinners. We have a deployment process with a build pipeline on Java CI. We have a code coverage, and of course the project is also published to NPM. So that's pretty neat. So let me know what you guys think. I can definitely go back to this series and perhaps add more interesting things to the library. But for the time being, I'm signing off. So that's been Alex at Code Realm, and I'm gonna see you next time. Thanks for watching.